Hello and welcome to today's webinar in which we'll equip you with the knowledge and strategies to create a truly inclusive learning environment when delivering NCFE qualifications. So my name's Rachel Webster and I'm joined by my colleague Beth Husband, and we're both provider development officers here at NCFE. And our role is to support centres through the planning, onboarding and further CPD opportunities for NCFE qualifications. We'll both be assisting as support hosts today, and we'll just monitor the chat and advance the presentation, just ensuring everything runs smoothly. But if you do have questions or you need assistance, please feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll do our best to help you. Now, our lead for the session is Gordon Kay. Hello and welcome, Gordon.
Hi, Rachel. Hi, everybody. So my name is, as Rachel just said, Gordon Kay. I am the formal title is Service Improvement Lead for Assessment Delivery here at NCFE. In a nutshell, what does that mean? It means that when it comes to external assessments and any qualification or assessment that we have that is delivered within a centre and marked by NCFE, I have responsibility over a range of processes related to that, from the timetabling of those assessments to right to the very end to results and post-results activities. So incorporated within that will be advice and guidance in relation to access arrangements, so reasonable adjustments, special considerations, those kind of things. So I'm here today as the so-called subject matter expert on this. As far as I possibly can, give you the NCFE line on things, and where possible, I will take questions and respond either during today's session, or if necessary, at a later time, I can facilitate specific requests from you. My email address is on the screen, so I can liaise with any member today, any attendee today, to respond to individual requests or to clarify any points that require clarification following today's session. Thank you.
Thank you. So today we're going to be looking at supporting learners with diverse needs through understanding access arrangements by exploring different types of access arrangements available and how you can implement them effectively, and making reasonable adjustments and learning how to identify reasonable adjustments that can support individual students' needs without compromising the integrity of the assessments.
So before we begin, I've already posted in the chat, and some of you started to fill it in beforehand, a poll on how confident you feel and in understanding access arrangements for level 1 to BCert qualification, or some of you may be here from other NCFE qualifications. So how confident do you feel in this topic? 1 being no to little confident and 10 being very confident. And that's the poll is within the chat. So we've got a few 3 to 4s, a few 5 to 6s. So hopefully by the end of the session, we will get that confidence levels up. If you haven't been able to access the poll, just pop your number in the chat as well.
Brilliant.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so now I'm going to pass you over to Gordon, our service improvement lead here at NCFE, and he'll begin with exploring the different types of access arrangements available and how to implement them effectively.
Thanks very much, Rachel and Beth. So I'd like to start by sort of just going through a piece of legislation that sort of underpins everything that we do here at NCFE in relation to access arrangements, and that's the Equality Act of 2010. And that requires all awarding bodies, all organisations to make reasonable adjustments to make sure that a learner who has a disability as defined in the Act is not placed at a substantial disadvantage in comparison to learners with no disabilities. The provision for those access arrangements are made to ensure that learners receive recognition of their achievement, so long as the equity, validity and reliability of assessments can be assured. Such arrangements are neither concessions to make assessments easier for learners, nor advantages to benefit the learner. There are some core aims that we operate by in assessment delivery within NCFE. One of those is to maintain the integrity of external assessment, and the other one is to make sure that no learner is either unfairly disadvantaged or advantaged by any of the decisions that we make. Any questions on the Equality Act at all? Okay, thank you. Access arrangements, there are various ways of defining this, and if you look at various different documentation, they will give you different definitions. But I think one of the easiest ways to think about it is that they will allow learners with specific needs, such as special educational needs, any disabilities or any temporary injuries, to access the assessment and show that what they know and what they can do without changing the demands of the assessment. By and large, what does that mean? It means that as an awarding body, we have to make, NCFE are required to make reasonable adjustments in advance where a learner who has a disability within the meaning of the Equality Act would be at a substantial disadvantage in comparison to someone who does not have that disability. We are required to take all reasonable steps to overcome that disadvantage. NCFE will take all reasonable steps to ensure no adverse effects occur because of any reasonable adjustments. Reasonable adjustments, as I say, are made in advance of the assessment, but we also have a separate section on special considerations that take place following an assessment. So access arrangements, broadly speaking, are subdivided into those two groups of reasonable adjustments that we know about in advance and special considerations that we can account for post-assessment. Thank you. Now, some of the things that access arrangements or reasonable adjustments must not and must do, and I'll explain some of the kind of rationale behind this. As I've said before, they must not invalidate the assessment requirements of the qualification. The assessments have been designed in a particular way, and we must make sure that whatever we do to alter anything about the setup for that assessment doesn't undermine the validity of that assessment. It should not give any learner an unfair advantage, because of course by doing so disadvantages all other learners. It should reflect to some extent or to a large extent the learner's normal way of working. Now, this is a phrase that we use a lot, normal way of working. Just to clarify a little bit about that, when we talk about in assessment terms, we are usually talking about a normal way of working for how a learner would be assessed within the centre for a similar style of piece of work. So for example, a mock assessment that may or may not reflect the learner's normal way of working for their everyday work. Usually it will, but it doesn't have to. It could be that that access arrangement is only made for that particular assessment, in which case we would define normal way of working to be what you would see in a mock assessment, for example. And it should be based on the individual needs of the learner. In other words, an adjustment of, say, 25% extra time won't necessarily apply to the whole group. It might only apply to certain learners under certain conditions. So it should be based on the individual needs of that particular learner. One or two or three important points to note. Access arrangements or reasonable adjustments will not be approved if they involve unreasonable cost. Now, sometimes we are given requests for example, font size in advance of the standards 36 font, and we will reject that request on the basis that it will be unreasonable cost for us to produce that without finding another way, if you like, of delivering that assessment to meet the needs of the learner. So unreasonable cost would be one way. If it involves unreasonable timeframes, now we have set timeframes for requesting things like paper modifications and so on. If we don't have those necessary timeframes, then we cannot approve that access arrangement for that learner. And finally, like I say, if it affects the security and integrity of the assessment, if by doing so it does not assess the learner or allow the learner to demonstrate their needs and the intention, the way that the assessment was designed. Thank you.
We have got a question in the chat,
Yep.
Gordon. It says, can
Okay.
I please just check that the following access arrangements will be relevant for the NCFE functionals, maths and English at entry level?
Okay. For entry level, because they are not what we define as externally assessed, in other words, they are internal assessments that are externally quality assured, they will not come under the scope of this particular discussion. This particular discussion will focus on external assessments. There will be some similarities with the entry-level ones, but they should be checked with our external quality assurance team, and Beth and Rachel can give you the email address for that team to request for the similar information from that team or a similar session dealing with those. The one exception would be entry level 3 for digital functional skills, where that is externally assessed, even though it's an entry level qualification. So when it comes to functional skills qualifications, we're really talking about level 1 and level 2 English reading and writing and mathematics, and entry level 3 and level 1 digital functional skills. Those will be in scope for this discussion. Thank you. And the way that we think and categorise learner needs is in terms of 4 different distinct categories. So first of all, we would look at cognition and learning needs. Now, the easiest way to think of that is it's most typically demonstrated by the specific learning difficulty of dyscalculia, or even more commonly, dyslexia. And that would be the cognition and learning need. Now, typically, that one would be, we'd have reasonable adjustments such as supervised rest breaks, extra time, computer readers, word processors, scribes, coloured overlays, these kind of adjustments that you would see for a typical learner with dyslexia or dyscalculia. Secondly, communication and interaction needs. Now, this would typically be someone who's on the autistic spectrum disorder or speech language and communication needs. And typically there, again, we would see extra time, scribe, read aloud, reading pens, these kind of adjustments taking place. Thirdly, a sensory or physical need. Now, that could be deaf, hard of hearing, it could be visual impairment, hearing impairment, multisensory impairment, or a physical disability. And there again, extra time, computer reader or reader, word processor, perhaps a live speaker, maybe braille papers, or even a practical assistant would be relevant for that particular category of need. And finally, learners who exhibit social, emotional, and mental health needs. And typically that would be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, or mental health conditions. And again, they would typically be supervised rest breaks, scribes, maybe separate rooms, separate invigilation, that kind of thing. Those examples I've given are typical examples, but they're not exhaustive. They're just for illustrative purposes only. For those people who are familiar with EHCPs, which I'll get onto in a little bit, that's Education Health Care Plans, even though they are holistic documents to some extent, they would probably categorise the learner using one of these 4 categories as being the key category for the requirement for the EHCP. So one of the first things as an awarding body we would look for is to actually understand what the category of need would be for that learner, no matter what the evidence was that was submitted on behalf of that learner. Any questions about category of need? No. Thank you. Now, types of adjustment. There's various ways of slicing and dicing types of reasonable adjustment, but one of the easier ways is to look at those that are centre delegated and those that are non-centre delegated. Non-centre delegated are those that require some sort of submission to NCFE. So therefore, they are things like, as you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen, additional language, a braille paper, coloured paper, enlarged paper, extra time, and so on, something where notification would need to be given. Not the centre delegated ones are ones in which effectively we don't really need to know about. So things like a bilingual dictionary, colour naming, a prompter, read aloud, room organisation, these kind of things. Supervised rest breaks could be a single supervised rest break of no more than 30 minutes in duration, or it could be multiple supervised rest breaks as per the duration of the assessment requires. Separate room would be invigilation requirements for learners, not advantaging or disadvantaging those learners over other learners, and any details would be recorded on external assessment paperwork to accompany the assessment. Listening to music, white noise, for example. Centres would check the devices playing music or white noise, cannot connect to the internet, and any audio files do not provide an advantage to the learners. Our guidance document, which is one of the key links that we will use here, is available on our website for additional detailed guidance on every type of adjustment that's out there that typically we would see. And there are some in the region of about 20 to 30 typical adjustments that we would see for our external assessments. So broadly speaking, From this slide, there are some categories that are centre delegated, in which case we don't need to know about them, no requirement for a notification to be submitted to us, and ones that are non-centre delegated, which for obvious reasons, and those obvious reasons being we would need to change something about the assessment setup, for example, producing the paper on Braille paper, or we would need to request potentially some evidence to back up the approval, so things like extra time. For those ones, they are non-centre delegated, and we would need notification for those ones. Thank you. Making reasonable adjustments. Okay. Thank you. What to consider? Points for you to consider. Centres and awarding bodies need to consider whether any adjustment to an assessment is appropriate. Access arrangements or reasonable adjustments should not compensate the learner for lack of knowledge or skills. The learner must be able to cope with the content of the assessment and work at the level required. So one of the requests we would have, and some of the times we have to push back on things, are where learners have been entered for assessments that clearly haven't been suitable for their category of needs. So we should check in advance, centres should check in advance that the course is suitable for that learner's needs before reaching the point of submitting reasonable adjustments on behalf of that learner. Competence standards should not be altered. Well, we should take responsibility to ensure reasonable steps to ensure learners with disability are not placed at a substantial disadvantage. There's no duty to make any adjustment to provision, criterion or practice defined as a competence standard. Learner performance is measured against set standards which cannot be altered, but it may be possible to change the delivery or process to the learner so that each learner has an equal opportunity. The qualification of a learner who's had an access arrangement must have the same credibility as that of any other learner. Vocational qualifications may lead to employment, so achievement of such qualifications must give a realistic indication to potential employers of what the holder of the qualification can do. Decisions about adjustments to assessment should be taken after careful consideration of the assessment needs of the individual learner, the assessment requirements of the qualification, and the nature and extent of the support given as part of normal teaching practice. Centres should not assume that the same reasonable adjustments will be required for all assessment types. There are various different assessment types that NCFE have. For the purposes of this demonstration today, we are mainly talking about the level 1-2 technical awards for our Cert qualification suite, which tend to be set date and time assessments for an external assessment. But if you do entail some other qualifications with NCFE, you may find different assessment types. You may find windowed assessments. You may find oral discussions, for example. You may find set projects, all sorts of things. And the different adjustments may apply differently depending on the nature of those assessments. So, for example, 25% extra time may apply because of a specific learning difficulty for a written assessment, but that may not apply for an oral part of a discussion. So therefore, we would then work with the centre to determine how that 25% should be applied if the assessment involved a combination of an oral discussion and a written assessment. A learner must have had an appropriate opportunities to practice using the access arrangement before the first examination. It should never be the first time that that learner has been exposed to whatever it might be, a computer reader, for example, or a human reader or whatever. This is particularly so where things like modified and large papers, a scribe, speech recognition technology, or so on will be used in assessments. Thank you. Evidence of needs. Now, this is complex. It'd be impossible really to go through that. There are some basic infographics out there on JCQ's website, which is very helpful. Broadly speaking, appropriate evidences of need are dependent on the adjustment being applied and the learner's conditions. So you go back to those categories of need, and if you match them against the particular adjustments, so for example, if it was cognition and it was 25% extra time, there would be specific bits of evidence that we would require. Multiple forms of evidence of need may be required for individual learners. So what you can see on the screen is an example of some of the types of evidence that can be provided. However, centres should use the Access Arrangements and Reasonable Adjustments guidance document available through our website for further guidance on evidence of need to ensure that all relevant and required evidence is provided if requested. This information is provided as suggested requirements. It's not exhaustive. So things like a statement of special educational needs, an educational health care plan, an IDP, an individual development plan, confirming the disability, an assessment carried out by a suitably qualified assessor, a Form 8 submission, supplementary evidence of the learner's normal way of working, or a SENCO signed or Form 9 submission are typical evidences of need for learners. Also, the next slide. Other evidences of need include a letter or report from a CAMS, a medical consultant, a registered psychologist, consultant, and so on, but essentially a medical professional qualified to give the diagnosis for that learner, or a letter or report from a local authority specialist service, occupational health, and so on, would be evidence of need for those ones as well. Thank you. Notifying us of our assessments. There are essentially two different possible ways in which this can be done. One would be through new registrations, and in the NCFE portal, we require centres to notify us of any non-centre delegated access arrangements that your learners may require prior to the assessment taking place. You would submit that through the paper modifications and/or access arrangements sections within the Edit Learner option. If you're amending an existing registration, or within the Add or Amend Learner Details option upon registration available in our NCFE portal. And there's a screenshot there to show you what we're talking about in terms of where the Add and Amend Learner Details would be for new registrations. For existing registrations, as you can see there, again, another screenshot, use the My Learners option in the ribbon, select Manage Learners, search for the learner, and click Edit, and it will take you to the screen that populates the list of possible reasonable adjustments for that learner. Note one thing here: when you submit a request for a particular learner and a particular adjustment, that will carry through to all external assessments in which that learner is then booked. So you don't have to do this multiple times. So if it's a reset or you're taking multiple qualifications within NCFE, once it's done once on the portal, it will apply to all external assessments that take place thereafter. Thank you. As I mentioned before, one of the reasons which we might not be able to accommodate requests for reasonable adjustments would be the timescales for the approval coming in. Paper modifications. So this is modified papers we have to modify in some way by putting them on different colours, by enlarging them, by using Braille. The modification submissions should be in line with the above timescales, processed within 5 working days of receipt. They'll be dispatched to arrive at your centre at least 3 working days before the scheduled start date of the assessment date or the assessment window. We do have a late paper modification request form that sits outside of the above timescales, and we can, depending on the nature of the request and depending on the availability of the modified papers, we can often accommodate those. So if you're not within those timescales, it's not that the learner won't be able to receive that paper. It's just that we will have to do some additional checks in the background to see if we can accommodate within the timescales and still have the paper sent out to you in advance of the assessment. So effectively what I'm trying to say there is that late paper modification requests would be considered on a case-by-case basis and may be rejected. Just be aware of that. So where possible, please fit the timeframes you've got there for the modified papers. Thank you. Future position. So the current position at the moment, and I'm sure that a lot of people on this call will be aware of this, the NCFE, although being a member of JCQ, are going through a transitional period in terms of alignment with JCQ processes. As part of that transition, we are fully aligned to some policies and some processes in relation to the delivery of assessments. For example, we're fully aligned with malpractice policies, with appeals policies, with special considerations, and also with regulation documents that relate to functional skills qualification suites, the ICE document. However, for other ones, we are in a kind of a position where we intend to align, but we're not there yet. And the guidance document in terms of reasonable adjustments and the use of things like access arrangements online that a lot of people might be familiar with, we are not quite there at the moment. However, that said, for this particular qualification suite, vCert level 1 and 2, we are working closely with JCQ right now to have that qualification suite added to the access arrangements online process for 25-26. So our intention at the moment is to align with access arrangements online, excluding paper modification requests, for our T-level core papers, employment SEB projects, occupational specialisms, our level 1-2 VCET external assessments and NEA, and all cash EYE, early year educator and health and social care applied generals, technicals and extended certificates. What that will mean is that the only qualification suites with an external assessment that are not aligned after the start of 25-26 will be our functional skills on demand external assessments, which we will look to try to align for 26-27, in addition with the paper modifications. So paper modifications will be excluded for 25-26. You will not submit those requests through access arrangements online. You'll continue to submit those through our portal or through our late paper modification request process. But for all other access arrangements from 25-26 onwards, you will submit those through access arrangements online the same way as you would do for GCSEs or any other assessment of that nature that fits within the access arrangement online approval process. Thank you.
We have got a question in the chat,
Yep.
Gordon. Can I ask for a bit more information about modified language papers, please?
Yeah, modified language papers. So those ones are what we used to call an oral language modifier. So this is where non-technical language within the paper is modified to meet the needs of the learner. Now, at NCFE, although that is offered as an adjustment, in reality, it's not required. And the reason for that is because papers are actually modified what we call at source. In other words, when we create the papers, when we produce the papers now, the non-technical language, and it's important to realise that, the non-technical language, so language that's not required for the actual individual assessment, is checked and gone through a rigorous process to make sure that it is at a level appropriate for that learner. Now, there will be extreme circumstances where that's not the case. So again, on a case-by-case basis, we may still, and one of the reasons why we've kept that as an option within the portal. But in general terms, all of our papers now are modified at source for appropriate language for the learner before they see the paper, the non-technical language. So generally speaking, what we find with NCFE is there is very little need for us to employ any form of modified language after the paper has been produced. As I say, there's this exceptional case where that happens, but generally speaking, you'll find that the language is appropriate for the level, meaning that it usually is at a lower level than the technical language that's required for the assessment itself. Thanks, Beth. I mentioned at the start that we could broadly speaking define access arrangements into two categories. The reasonable adjustments that take place before the assessment takes place, but also special considerations that take place after the assessment. Thank you. Now, this is one of the areas where we are now aligned with JCQ policy and their deadlines for VCET qualifications. So there may be times when a learner is disadvantaged in some way at the time of the assessment for reasons outside their control. It could be temporary illness, injury, bereavement. It could be a disruption during the assessment. Any adverse circumstances which may have impacted the learner's ability to demonstrate their usual level of attainment at the time of the assessment. A special consideration is a post-assessment adjustment that, where applicable and appropriate, can help to mitigate the impact on a learner. It could include a small mark adjustment for learners who are present but disadvantaged, or in some cases may include a mark adjustment made by NCFE if a learner was absent from the assessment for acceptable reasons. They can only be submitted by a centre, and before submitting any request, you must ensure you've reviewed our policy and above. They must be raised via our special consideration form found on our website. Best practice, we are now aligned, as I say, with the JCQ policy and deadlines on VCERTs. On the form, be clear in the comments around whether the learner attempted the assessment or whether they were absent, as that will impact our decisions on whether the learner is eligible for a percentage uplift or a replacement grade. Give as much detail as you possibly can on the form on the circumstances leading to the special consideration. And be aware that we may need to contact you for additional information. Prompt reply to this will allow for the correct special consideration applied for results released for learners. So obviously any delays on the interactions between us could potentially result in a delay to the learner's results. So it's important that we obviously, you know, we correspond backwards and forwards on this. It's very rare for us to just receive a special consideration request or an assessment variation request and actually be able to approve or reject right away. Usually there's an element of dialogue that needs to take place between the centre and the awarding body before a final approval or rejection takes place in these cases. Thank you. Now, what I thought it would be useful to sort of summarise with towards the end is some typical questions that exams officers or course practitioners have posed to us throughout the last few years around access arrangements and reasonable adjustments, and for me to give you some idea of our response to those. Thank you. So in no particular order, as they say, Form 9s are not referenced in NCFE's existing documentation. Can they replace the SENCO file note for all relevant reasonable adjustment requests? So the answer is yes. Form 9s, as people will probably be aware, were introduced as a way of confirming medical reasons, but any NCFE reference to a file note is now superseded or covered by Form 9. So wherever in our documentation we talk about the requirement for a SENCO file note, a Form 9 will suffice in those cases. Next question, JCQ require notification in relation to the use of music or white noise. Do NCFE require this too? The short answer is not yet. We've taken a decision at the moment to allow that to be centre delegated. But as I've said before, we require the centre to check the content, to check there's no internet connection, and we would strongly suggest that any learner who is using white noise or musical device be accommodated separately. What I would say again, because of something I said a couple of slides ago, because of the alignment piece now with JCQ from summer 25 onwards, or rather from autumn 25 onwards, we will be requiring that to be notified in accordance with access arrangements online. Can a bilingual dictionary be used with 25% extra time and no notification to NCFE? We would still require the notification. So you would put the 25% extra time on the edit learner part of the screen, as we saw before, but it wouldn't be included in our sample for evidence. So if you were asked to provide evidence for that learner, that would be excluded from that. Bilingual dictionaries can be used with 25% extra time, but there are certain conditions that apply to the use of bilingual dictionaries. First of all, the main language must not be English, Irish or Welsh. The learner must have been in the UK within the last 3 years, must be new to the English language. English language must not be spoken in their home, and they must not have been exposed to previous educational environment delivered or tested in the English language. The time taken should reflect the time just for the dictionary consultation part of the adjustment. So the 25% should indicate that the learner does require 25% to access the dictionary. And it should reflect, again, normal way of working, how that learner would work in the class time, but also within any mock assessment environment. Given current waiting times for specialist referrals, will NCFE accept evidence from GP or health practitioners in place of formal diagnoses? Now, this is where a health professional has diagnosed or has not diagnosed, has referred the learner to a specialist to confirm things like the communication, social interaction diagnosis that we had at the start, or the social, emotional, mental health issues we talked about at the beginning. So the short answer to this is yes. As probably anybody who's been involved in this process knows, the waiting times for these are excessive at the moment and can be in some cases years. So if the learner is on the list to be screened and there is notification of that from a recognised medical professional, then we will accept that in lieu of the formal diagnosis, provided that it's supplemented by a picture of need that comes from the centre as well. So indications, for example, of how that adjustment has been applied in regular classwork, maybe some examples of classwork, and so on. So the answer to that question, yes, we will accept the referral rather than the actual diagnosis itself. For additional time of up to 25%, is the evidence requirement always the same? No. For the different categories of needs, the different evidences for 25% will be seen. So for example, for cognition, for the specific learning difficulties, so typically dyslexia, we would require test scores usually provided there's no education health care plan. At the moment, we require one low score, which is slightly different from JCQ at the moment. But for other areas that are non-cognition, so things like the social emotional, the physical and mental health and so on, we would require specialist evidence and again the Form 9 or the file note, so not the test scores for those 25%. So again, it goes back to one of those slides I was talking about earlier, where we would look for a category of need to begin with before determining what the most appropriate form of evidence would be. And the final question on that screen, what are the evidence requirements for extra time requests over 25%? So this is something we see increasingly now. And for people who are unfamiliar with the process, there tend to be 3 bands with extra time, up to 25%, then between 25% or 26% and 50%, and then over 50%. Now, over 50% is virtually unheard of. It's very, very rare, and we would probably only approve 1 or 2 of these per year across all of our qualification suites. They need to be incredibly extreme. The example we often give is a learner who is visually impaired but cannot access Braille, for example, and would require significant extra time within the paper to be able to meet the demands of the assessment. In general terms, it would be very, very rare for a learner to be approved over 50%. Even for 26 to 50%, there are several points that would need to be addressed in addition to the usual requirements for 25%. So for example, we would require confirmation that the learner has persistent and significant difficulties. We would need to have a test score for the cognition that took place within the last 2 years. We would need to have evidence of the learner's difficulties and how they substantially impact on teaching and learning. We would need an indication of the maximum amount of time required, not necessarily always 50. Evidence of how it's been determined, show the involvement of teaching staff, and confirm that without it, the learner would be at a substantial disadvantage. And again, we need to confirm it was the learner's normal way of working. So there are a series of bullet points to be addressed, and they're all contained within our guidance document if you're ever unsure about the evidence requirements for learners that may require over 25% extra time. Thank you. Next set of questions, last set of questions actually. Will the education health care plans in themselves be sufficient evidence for reasonable adjustment requests? Not necessarily. It really depends on the specific references that are in the EHCPs. For people familiar with EHCPs, they cover a range of different aspects to do with the learner's upbringing and development. In that, there will be the occasional reference to assessments, and if in that reference it specifically calls out the adjustment that's required, then that will be proof in itself. However, very often we will require some sort of supplementary information, for example, a file note, Form 9, something like that, to indicate that the actual adjustment that's been requested is justified and is seen as a normal way of working for that learner. So chances are, if you just simply submit an EHCP as sole piece of evidence, it won't be initially accepted. They will require some additional evidence. The only exception would be if the EHCP does go into the detail that's required to actually cover off external assessments and the particular adjustments required. What measures do NCFE take in relation to sensitive nature of supporting documentary evidence? So if your centre was sampled for evidence and you did have an EHCP, very often the question is raised about the sensitive nature of the content of that documentation. So at the moment, NCFE uses a secure link service, which will naturally expire within 30 days. So therefore, there will be no visibility on either end of that after the initial approval takes place. Failing that, one of the other options that centres have is to show redacted versions or truncated versions of the EHCP that take out some of that sensitive information and just include the bits that allude to the external assessment or to any cognition part of that EHCP. That would be perfectly adequate as far as we were concerned. So if you do have reservations about sharing some of the sensitive data that's contained in an EHCP, those are the measures that I would advise that you take within the centre if asked for that documentary evidence. How do I add a learner's RA request after an assessment window has begun? Now, For those people that are familiar with the Model 5 for this Level 1, Level 2 technical awards for V-Certs, you will know that when you make a registration onto the qualification, you're expected to make a booking onto both the external assessment and the non-examined assessment. Now, the non-examined assessment takes place or starts officially quite early within the year, and as soon as it starts, the way the system is done, because those two assessments are linked together, it will not allow you then, because that assessment has started, to add a reasonable adjustment after that to the learner's entry in the portal. So the only way you can do that is by waiting until the external assessment has finished and then retrospectively adding it to the portal, and that's what we would request in this scenario. So we would still say go ahead and apply the reasonable adjustment, mark it on the invigilator's register or the assessment register, and then we will check when we receive that documentation back that it's been put on the portal, and then we will request the evidence retrospectively if required. Next one, can a human reader and scribe be used without penalty to the learner? For this particular qualification suite, yes, in that there are no spelling, punctuation and grammar or quality of written communication marks offered within the assessment criteria for our V-Cert suite. And that isn't necessarily the case for our other assessments. So for example, if you're doing a T-level core paper with us or a functional skills paper with us, quality of written communication and spelling, punctuation and grammar are required. So in those cases, you might not be able to use a human reader because a human reader would have nuance in the way that they read the assessment. You would, however, be able to use a computer reader or a reading pen. You may be able to use a scribe for a written assessment. However, there may be additional requirements for the learner to prove that they've met the spelling, punctuation and grammar required for that. And that would be covered in the scribe cover sheet that would accompany the assessment paper when it's returned. So that's for those assessments that do have spelling, punctuation and grammar marks assigned to them. But just for clarity, for this particular qualification suite, the V-Cert Level 1-2 Technical Award, there are no such marks, and so you can go ahead and use human readers and scribe without penalty to the learner, provided you have the evidence, of course, to justify that. Will NCFE accept access arrangements online submissions for summer 2025 assessments? As I've indicated before, the alignment piece will only take place from autumn of 2025. So we will not accept access arrangements online submissions for this upcoming summer's assessments. We will require a portal submission and obviously an evidence check that should be retained within the centre should we sample you for evidence. Will NCFE accept online or non-standardised tests as evidence of need for my learner? So we're thinking here about the category of need that was cognition and specific learning difficulties, and the answer to that question is no. Any formal tests that take place have to be standardised. There is a body called the Special Awards Committee, SASC, that publish a list of standardised tests that are typically used within centres and by assessors to assess categories of need. Now, in those cases, those approved tests will produce a standardised score. There are many other tests out there that produce non-standardised scores, or they are online tests that take place without a human intervention. Those ones cannot be used as actual evidence themselves. What they can be used as the picture of need for the learner, or to screen the learner to give you an indication as to whether further assessments are required to then confirm the diagnosis. But those online assessments only, or those non-standardised tests, cannot be used as a replacement for the standardised test scores for things like 25% extra time for cognition and learning needs. Thank you. Beth, Rachel, any questions in the chat? Yeah.
Yes, we're just about to read them out. We've got,
thank you.
As all of our learners have EHCPs, would a SENCO letter be sufficient form of extra evidence if a specific exam adjustment aren't outlined in the EHCP?
It would depend to some extent, obviously, on the nature of so something like extra time over 50% or 25 to 50%, no. But a standard reasonable adjustment of 25% extra time, for example. And again, it would depend largely on the category of need that's been outlined in the EHCP. The EHCP will demonstrate what those categories of needs are. But generally speaking, an EHCP, if accompanied by a file note or a Form 9, will suffice for the standard reasonable adjustments for NCFE.
Okay. And then there's no more questions in the chat. Is there any more questions? Pop them in the chat before the end of the webinar. Rachel and I will share a few resources and support available. But first, just how confident are you now with the topics that we've covered today? If you could add your number in the chat, and again, 1 being not very confident and 10 being extremely confident. So we're getting 8, so that's brilliant. All your information, Gordon's got everybody up from 3s to 8s.
Thanks, but just where people are doing that, I appreciate this is a very complex area to get your head around. And for the benefit of those people out there that are listening to me that are exams officers themselves, I can tell you that I once, upon a time in a previous life, was an exams officer myself. So I know all too well from both sides how difficult this area is and how changeable this area is.
Right, there's no further questions in the chat, so I'll hand over to you, Rachel, for resources and support.
So I'd just like to provide you with some details and further support available to you. You can also visit our portal guide, our special considerations page, and access arrangements, reasonable adjustments on our website. And if after today you do have any further questions, then please do feel free to contact us using our general email, which is the provider.development@ncfe.org.uk. And your questions or queries will be directed to the appropriate NCFE colleagues.
There's one thing I would like to add as well, for those people who still feel, I'm still only a 7 at this or lower or whatever it might be. If you can have a think about the kind of things that make you feel like, why am I not higher? And if you can give that via the links that Rachel's given there or directly to me, then I can pick things up with you on a kind of one-to-one basis and hopefully, get you to a stage where you feel more confident. So I appreciate there's a lot to take in with me just sitting talking for 45 minutes here and expecting you to kind of, understand everything I've talked about and be able to retain that. And that's an unrealistic ask. So for those people who are still feeling a little bit unsure about certain things or whatever, please pick it up with me directly or with my team. And we will address any concerns you've got and hopefully upskill you and assist in your kind of like your understanding in this area. Thank you.
Thanks.